Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight's video has been graciously sponsored by Audible. As you can imagine, I lead a very busy life, as I'm sure many of you do too, which leaves very little time to pick up a book and read. But thankfully, we have all the books we want to read read to us via Audible. I'm already an Audible addict and have been for quite some time, having binged all the Harry Potter books, the complete work of Sherlock Holmes, and much more, currently listening to Stardust. This is something I think pretty much everyone here would enjoy. So, why not have a month of free listening on me? Try it out, link in the description. Not to mention you could listen to the audiobook I narrated, if you want to. Finally, before the video begins, I narrated a really interesting story. The story of Vlad the Impaler over on my brother's channel, History Profiles. I'd appreciate it if you could go check that out after, but ultimately it's up to you. Thanks guys. But now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. So I went camping this one time with my friend. It was 10 PM and I really needed to go. I left our site and used the restroom, which is about a quarter of a mile away. It's pitch dark, and as I'm walking I see one of my friends who was walking with us from a path leading to an unused site onto the main path. This unused site path was a good 50 yards away from our site path. My friend has a very noticeable and peculiar gait, so I knew it was him. At multiple points he turned around and asked, "Why are you following me?" Always a good 40 or so feet ahead of me. I would reply, "I literally told you guys I was going to the bathroom." And question, "Why did you come from a different site?" He picked his pace up and I eventually lost him in the darkness. I get to the restrooms without seeing him, do my business, and upon returning to my site, where he of course is, I start asking him why he's messing with me. Everyone denied that my friend even left. Okay, so they're messing with me. No big deal. 3 AM rolls around. I need to pee. No need to walk to the restrooms this time. I just walk off into the woods. And as I walk back after I take a leak, I hear the distinct sound of a tent zipper opening. In the darkness I can tell it's my friend. Then I can barely see but definitely hear him zip it back up. As I get closer to the tents, I see him more clearly and he walks a bit, goes to light a cigarette and I can see his face in the flint strikes of the lighter. And even clearer still when he manages to catch it. He lights his cigarette, takes a puff and says, "Can you hear me?" "Yeah, I can hear you, what's up?" He then repeats himself, "Can you hear me?" "Yeah, are you trying to wake everyone up, dude?" He shakes his head at me, then turns around and walks towards the cars, maybe 30 feet away from him. I'm thinking he's messing with me again. I gotta follow but lose him behind a car. I turn the corner and he's nowhere to be seen. I'm annoyed. He thinks he's so funny. So I go back to his tent, which is still closed, and I can still hear him faintly snoring inside. I don't know what I saw, but it looked exactly and sounded exactly and walked exactly like my friend. I was slightly inebriated, but not enough to hallucinate. He denies he ever left his tent, or went through the woods ahead of me. The summer after my second year in high school, I went up to the Pike National Forest in Colorado for a summer field biology camp. It was pretty cool because I had never been camping prior. I had a small 2-man tent that I shared with my buddy from school. We had met this kid at camp and instantly became really good friends. His parents were loaded and his tent, which was about 10 feet from ours, was huge, like a 10-person tent. The night before this incident, a huge windstorm blew through the valley and absolutely annihilated his huge tent. Mine was fine, it was low to the ground. Anyway, for the rest of the time he slept in our already packed tent. I slept closest to the door of the tent because I always have to pee in the middle of the night and didn't want to climb over people. So the night this all went down, I woke up, no idea what time it was, and went outside to the forest, peed and crawled back into the tent. I was laying there for a bit. There happened to be a lightning storm over my head, cloud to cloud. As I was watching the light illuminate my tent, I started hearing whispering. It was a female whispering back and forth. I tried to hear what it was saying, but it was inaudible. The whispering started to get closer and closer until it was right next to the tent, next to my right ear. It just stopped. I didn't hear anyone else walking or anything. Then all of a sudden, lightning lit up the tent and there were shadows of people being cast on the side of the tent. I just about crapped myself. That's right when the chanting began. It sounded like a different language, and all females, a bunch of them. I closed my eyes and slipped under my sleeping bag and put my hands over my ears. The next day at breakfast, we all went back to the tent to get changed, and the new guy who was now staying with us, "Pretty wild last night, right?" To which I responded, "The lightning. No, the freaky-ass chanting. I think this place is cursed or something," he said. So it wasn't just me. But it did help that someone else heard it, and we could talk about it. Now every time I go camping, I stop drinking all liquids 2 hours before I plan to sleep, so I don't wake up in the middle of the night and need to pee. This story was told to me by my cousin. We were swapping spooky stories at my uncle's cabin when he told me this one. He and 2 friends decided to take off for the weekend and go camping. They grabbed their gear, food, and camper van and drove out to the mountain range. They checked the forecast beforehand and it said sunny, with no precipitation for the duration of the weekend. It's mid-July. As they're setting up camp, Dave says he's going to eat some magic mushrooms and go for a vision quest. The other 2 laugh at it and tell him to be careful and not to wander too far. A few hours pass and Dave is yet to return. As it's starting to get dark, he emerges from the bushes with a puzzled look on his face. He explained that the trip was going fine, until he turned around and realized that he'd lost track of the path. He stumbled around the forest for what seemed an eternity, in a thought loop. It wasn't until he stumbled and fell that he realized he was going in the opposite direction of the camp, so he turned around and doubled back. As evening sets in, the crew is getting ready to call it a night, when it starts to snow. Then it starts to really snow, blizzard even. They pack everything in the van and decide to leave the next day. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, Jake, my cousin, wakes up covered in goosebumps. He climbs out of his bed and wanders around the van, first checking to make sure it's locked, and it is. He turns and tries to look out the window, and it's completely frosted over. As he's trying to make anything out at all, a feeling comes over him like there's something bad, or something looking directly back at him from outside. He dismisses it and goes back to bed. The next morning they awake to snow still coming down, Jake still thinking about last night, and walks around to the window as he felt uneasy. To his horror, there are bipedal tracks leading up to the van window, but none leading away. He runs and tells his friends, and they agree to get out of there. They get to the nearest gas station, which is still very remote, and their van breaks down. As they're trying to figure out what to do, this fella drives up to the pump and says, "We haven't seen weather like this for 20 years. You boys be careful out there, something's not right." Then he drives away. Out of nowhere, this large, dark red van pulls up directly in front of them, and the truck driver says, "Hurry up, get in, I'll take you to the nearest town." With a little hesitation, they get inside. As they drive, he starts going faster and faster until they reach speeds not recommended for winter. Sure that they're gonna perish at this, ghost white and speechless they ride. He gets them to the nearest town, opens the doors and says, "Hurry up, get out." They oblige, and before they can even thank him, he does a U-turn and goes back in the same direction he came in. They later found out the first man they spoke to at the gas station drove a few kilometers and only met his demise via head collision in the storm. It's a crazy world we live in. It's an interesting story. It comes from a very honest person too. He wouldn't exaggerate the details. Let me know what you think. Do you think there was something pulling strings? I'm also intrigued by the guy who drove them out there. Very mysterious. This would have been somewhere near Jasper National Park in Canada. Earlier in the year, I went on a long road trip across the states, mainly visiting the national parks and a few cities along the way. Towards the end of the trip, we found ourselves staying in the small town of West Yellowstone. This appeared to be an ideal base while we explored Yellowstone National Park. We booked into a pretty creepy but cheap motel just off the main street for a couple of nights. Me and my fiancé had one room, and my parents another. On the first morning there, we planned to get up early, catch the sunrise, and hopefully spot some of the local wildlife. So our alarms were set for 5 a.m. At about 4:45, I was woken by a loud banging on the door, followed by crying and shouting. I instantly jumped out of bed, thinking the worst had happened. I opened the door to my mum in a state of panic, saying that there's someone screaming. A woman is screaming. There, clear as day, I could hear the woman screaming. It sounded as though it was within 100 feet of us, and Mum claimed that it had been happening for the last half hour. We wanted to call the police, but had no phone signal, no phones in the rooms, and we were the only people about. After listening for another 10 minutes or so, we realized we never once heard any form of words come from this scream. No help or get off, just loud, odd old screams. Now, thinking this could be just some local fox or something, we all hit YouTube and Google trying to find a sound clip of the same thing, but no luck. Then, after I'd been hearing the scream for about a half hour, a police officer seemed to appear out of nowhere. He started asking questions about what we were doing and why we were up, and we thought he'd come about the scream, and we quickly told him everything. He then heard the scream and sped off townwards. The scream got less frequent and eventually stopped, so we decided to go about our day. We saw the lovely sights of Yellowstone and even showed several park rangers the video to see if it's an animal, but they all said they had not heard anything like it before. So when we got back to town that evening, we stopped into the sheriff's office to try and get some info. This was met with a lot of hostility from both the reception lady, who eventually closed the shutter in our face, and the same officer we'd seen in the morning. They both said exactly the same thing, almost scripted. "Sorry, ma'am, but that was an intoxicated woman yelling for her boyfriend." I didn't quite understand how they can put it down to someone shouting to their boyfriend. I get it, people get really wasted, but not to a point where you can't even say words. Later that night I did further research, which leads me to loads of different things, but ultimately brought me to the Native American skinwalkers. One thing in particular that struck me was there is a lot of accounts stating that skinwalkers will pretend to be injured humans or even babies to lure in new prey. After really listening to the screams, it almost sounds human in places, but at the same time perhaps sounds like a wild lion. What the hell could this have been? My wife and I were camping last night in Blue River Reservoir in Oregon. We camp here often and decided to explore up FSR 520 and found a cool abandoned bridge far back in the woods over Cook Creek. The spot was beautiful, and we were set up over the river on this long abandoned bridge over the creek. If you've ever been up to Oregon woods, you know that they can give off a creepy vibe, and this was no exception. But it really was a dream campsite. Being 40 feet directly over a river, while on a bridge with limbs growing everywhere over it, isn't your everyday spot. I'll throw in for background that there was no one within at least 3 miles of us, and we had to hike a little from our car, approximately 1/10 of a mile. We explored around the area for quite a bit and didn't come across anything out of the ordinary besides a pair of shoes and a name Mona, written in ash on a rock of a firing. While we were sitting by the fire, I noticed a very bright flash of light over the river and snapped my head up but didn't see anything. A few moments later, I was paying closer attention and watched a ball of light float, even with the bridge 40 feet in the air, from one side to the other of the woods over 50 feet. The light was very blue. My first thought is that I should have heard a car if it were headlights. But how could a car or the lights arrive to such an isolated area? The blue light was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I mentioned it to my wife, but didn't want to freak her out, so dropped the subject soon after. Later that night in the tent, we had the mesh lining up where we could see outside. My wife gasped and watched as the same blue light floated at the other end of the bridge, 30 feet away, and hovered in the air. After a good bit of time, it shot into the woods. It being late at night, we were obviously scared of someone's headlamp, but it shot 40 times quicker away than any human could go, and we saw nothing attached. Our dog left the tent and stared at that spot for the next 10 minutes, while also peeking down the side of the bridge very seriously. Has anyone had a similar experience on Forest Development Road 520 in Blue River Reservoir, Oregon? I'd love to hear it. My husband and I have been together 9 years, and this happened on our first real date. I want to start off by saying I am an absolute skeptic, to the point where I've always secretly scoffed about paranormal activities. Yet, I can't explain this. I met my husband in a little dive bar he was managing. We clicked instantly, and he's a very outdoorsy guy, so we hooked up a couple of times, then he officially asked me out on an overnight hike. I had a 10-month-old St. Bernard pup who of course came with. We drove up way past Cougar towards Mount St. Helens and parked on the trailhead leading to Bolt Camp. It's just a little shelter along the Lewis River, about 5 to 6 miles in. So we packed all our gear and even a backpack for my dog and headed out. I can't stress how beautiful that hike is. Massive Doug firs covered with moss. Sometimes there were little wooden bridges crossing streams along the trail. My husband would always yell, "Watch out for trolls," when we crossed them. We got kind of a late start, so the sun went down and it was almost fully dark by the time we arrived. There were so many hollow stumps, the setting sun would shine through them, and they lit up inside. They looked like little hobbit houses with fires burning through the hearths. And the mushrooms, my God, they were bioluminescent ones that glowed green in the dark. It took forever, and he kept saying it was around the next bend, but it never was. We finally arrived and unpacked. It was awesome. You can Google Bolt Camp. It's a wooded, 3-sided shelter. You'll even see my saint in one of those pics. People leave stuff at Bolt Camp for the next folks. Someone had left a half bottle of scotch. We partook in that when we left, and we hung a little baggie of weed from the rafters and some beer and water. Anyway, we made a fire and cooked steak on rocks, got drunk and fell in love. I fell asleep first and slept towards the inside of the shelter. My now husband and dog towards the outside. It was late in October and quite dry. It was very, very cold and the fire wouldn't stay lit. Eventually he fell asleep too. My St. Leo kept growling in the dark, and they bonded over that. "What do you see, buddy? What's out there?" They were both awake when I awoke. Thinking it was 2 to 3 a.m., I was facing the back wall of the shelter, and then I saw it. A wispy, gossamer, cobweb-looking thing floating to and fro in the back of the shelter. It would flip and spin and turn over itself. It was so beautiful and fascinating. I wasn't scared. I was really thinking I wanted to wake him up, but I barely knew the dude and was afraid he would think I was nuts. So I watched it until I fell asleep. Morning came, and I never mentioned it. We fed the dog, ate a bunch of trail mix and cheese and sausage, and hiked back. Then I dropped him off at his place. Like I said, we fell in love that night and moved in together some months later. We were reminiscing about our awesome hike when he decided to share something with me. I dropped him off that day at his house, and that same evening he was out on his porch having a smoke when he saw something. A cobwebby thing turning over and over on itself, floating back and forth in the street lamps. He found this interesting. He watched it and finally it settled on a clump of bushes. He went to take a closer look and a pair of glowing red eyes materialized, and he decided he wanted no part in it and ran away. This is a man afraid of nothing. Anyway, I obviously immediately told him about what I had seen and how I was too embarrassed to share. The similarities are too great. It had to be the same thing. Also, I've searched and searched and can't find any legends that match up with the description of the thing we saw. If anyone has any idea of what it could be, please advise. This all started 2 years ago, in the beginning of October 2018. My dad and I went camping in southern Ohio. I was 34 and my dad was 58 at the time. We went over to my grandma's house because she has a lot of secluded woods and basically lives in the middle of nowhere. The area has had a history of religious practices by the Hopewell Indians and occultism by certain groups who go into the woods on certain dates and perform ceremonies, but I thought nothing of it. These ceremonies have been witnessed by my cousin while hunting and by my grandparents for years now. I parked my car and my dad and I began carrying all the camping equipment to the deep woods. We ended up walking 3 to 4 miles back and finally found a spot to settle in and pitch the tent. After an hour or so, we decided to move from that spot to the top of the fairly large hill to have a better view, and I feared it might rain and didn't bring the top to cover my tent properly to keep the rain out. As we walked to the top, we ended up running into an 1800s style cabin, standing, but had no doors, no windows. But the roof was intact, and it did have all 4 walls and a roof. I have seen this cabin many times, as it is along a trail through the woods near my grandma's property. And this was the worst mistake we could have ever made during this trip. I had all my camping gear and food lined up on some old wooden benches, in which the cabin had 2 benches in total. It was around 7:30 when we set up our tent and other things. We could hear cars echoing off the hills when they would drive by, and we were about 3 to 4 miles to the nearest exit of the woods, and there was no one around in any direction, and there are a few people who live out in this part of Ohio. After an hour to hour and a half of being out there, at around 8:30 to 9, I start to hear these faint whispers in the corner of the cabin which caught me off guard, and I was a little disturbed to say the least. I asked my dad if he hears the whispering as well, and he says, yes. As I'm sitting there trying to figure out where these sounds are coming from exactly, looking in the direction I hear them, I see nothing. We had a few flashlights with us as well, and I could see nothing. They eventually stopped after 15 to 20 minutes. As Dad and I were laying there all of a sudden, a large cat walked into our space from the outside and sat right next to our tent. I can hear this large cat because it began purring with a very deep tone, as mountain lions would stand about a foot from us. I'm lying petrified in my tent, as well as my dad, who's just listening to this cat, and as it walked to us, it hit the top of my head, as I'm tall, 6'2", and the tent wasn't quite big enough. To remind you, I'm an avid outdoorsman and hunt and have fished. I've never experienced something like this camping in Ohio. I've camped all over the US and have lived in places including Minnesota, North Dakota, Idaho, but originally from Ohio. I also have no weapons with me because in Ohio I never had an issue. As we lay there, I began to sit up with my flashlight to see this cat, but I see nothing and it continues to purr deeply. I saw a shadow outside, as we had light in the top middle of our tent, so it should have cast a shadow when it walked nearby. I know for a fact it wasn't a bobcat, which Ohio has. Its purring was much too powerful sounding to be a cat log that size. As I'm sitting up in the tent, the cat begins pummeling my food and bottles of Mountain Dew that I'd put on the benches, and then shortly after sounded like it jumped from one of the windows. I sat there in amazement over this and could not understand what just happened. To my surprise, it only got much worse. Not long after the cat left, we then began to hear leaves ruffling and a bipedal creature over and over again throughout the night with large limbs, and trees breaking, and small rocks being thrown out the cut-out windows. I got my flashlight and shined it towards the ruffling of the leaves, but the strange thing was you could not see a physical creature in the direction of the sound, nor the limbs breaking. These same patterns of leaves and branches breaking continued over and over again. I went back to my tent dumbfounded, and soon after my dad and I heard 2- and 4-legged creatures start to run around the cabin, making all kind of ungodly sounds, lasting at least 5 to 10 minutes. Then out of nowhere, one of these creatures starts beating on the side of the cabin, hitting it twice with a thundering noise. My hair started to stand on end. I was in utter shock, along with my dad. These same patterns of sounds lasted 8 hours, before we eventually packed a few things and decided to run for it. Before we left, the beating of the cabin grew louder with each hit. The last hit of the cabin before we decided to leave was around 4 a.m. It was so loud I thought I was going to be deaf from it. I can only describe this sound as a large 12-gauge shotgun, 3.5-inch buckshot loaded in it, and shot in a close proximity to hear the sound. As we got up to leave, we had our flashlights on, standing back to back, walking out, and everything went silent all around us. As we got so far on the trail, we began running along until we reached a valley in the woods, and we stopped, because just to the right of us stood this creature. It was so dark in the woods, even with a flashlight, but you could see this creature standing on a small hill, looking down on us with yellow eyes set pretty far apart from each other, and it appeared from our distance to be at least 7 foot tall. If I had to guess, the outline was massive, you see. It seemed like this thing was absorbing the light shined on it. It literally just stood there, never moving, never wavering while we stared. We decided to keep running until we got out the woods and off the trail, which still had 2 to 3 miles to go. We made it out the woods without further encounters or incidences, but it didn't end there. As we got to the road, we started walking towards my grandma, where we were parked with my SUV, and right in front of us was a bridge that's very small in size where a creek runs through. As we got off the bridge, in the distance we saw the same yellow eyes and shined my flashlight on it, but it took off running into the side of small woods. Soon after it ran into the woods, we heard an owl hooting a few times, and right after the hooting sound, we heard a loud deep groan call out, and then the groan changed into a few very deep mumbling sounds, almost like it was trying to talk or make words, but it sounded like a bunch of nonsensical words. I again stood there in shock. Never in my life have I ever heard that sound. And the craziest thing was literally it sounded like it was 15 to 20 feet away when it occurred. We ran the rest of the way to my grandma's house, waking her up and telling her what happened. I then got my keys and left. Nothing else occurred as we drove out that place. I grew up in this area, and the only time I heard of something happening was when I was 10. So, me and both my uncles ran down the house shaking from head to toe. They explained that they were hunting late, and it got really dark on them, and they were beginning to walk. As they were walking, they saw a creature or animal begin to growl and chase them, but they couldn't see it. They were back to back shooting shotguns in the direction of this creature, which did nothing to scare it away, and it chased them all the way, and never once did they look back to see what it was. After my night from hell, I felt like I was in the Twilight Zone and would never return to camp in that area again. It has bothered me to this day, wondering what in the world took place, and what in the world were those creatures from hell. My parents forced me into a church camping. It wasn't from any church, and I didn't want to be friends with the people there. My female cousin went too, so we had a nice conversation. The place was okay, but but around it had a lake and a bridge to the forest to the other side of the lake. There was this weird air in the area around the camping place where we were at. I remember exploring it, and there was a very bad energy there. Ripped clothes, campfires that looked old, black trash bags hanging in the trees, all that in the forest around the camping area. At one of the last 3 nights there, they finally lit a campfire for us to be around. Me and my cousins were talking for a moment, and then we remained quiet for 5 minutes. I looked away into the forest, and there was a little lake splitting us from there. Suddenly I saw a man running around the lake in the forest area. He was wearing a white, huge Jesus kind of cloth and using no shoes. He ran very fast and I watched him and felt very scared. I looked at my cousin and then she looked at me spooked. I asked her if she saw something and she described exactly what I saw. We got that creepy feeling from it and nobody from the church believed us. Even to this day I can remember the man, who was tall in white robes and very pale, running on bare feet, giving off this awful vibe. My family and I were camping at Bucks Lake in California last summer. Our campsite was located right near the water. Other campsites were about 100 feet away and a bathroom within walking distance down the narrow road. 2 days into the trip, my son and I were getting ready to take our canoe onto the lake. I sat at camp as my son walked down the small road to the bathrooms. I waited for a while and decided to walk over to the bathrooms. I never saw him come out and thought he walked back in a different direction. On my way back to camp, he was sitting there waiting for me. He looked surprised and asked me why I had walked right by him and didn't say anything. I was shocked and told him I never saw him walk out the bathroom. The campsite is situated where you can see the bathrooms from our narrow parking spot next to our parked cars. I was sitting in a chair facing the bathroom watching him walk in there and waited the whole time, yet he never passed me. However, my son said that when he walked right past me, I was getting out my chair and I actually brushed up against his arm. He looked right at me, but I apparently just ignored him. I told my mum about this right after it happened, and she explained to me how a similar thing happened to him back a few days earlier. He was in his room when she walked in to say hi. When he wasn't there, she walked back to the living room, where he approached her and asked her why she'd come into his room, looked at him, and then just left. When I was around 5, I went camping with my parents in a place called Bear Creek Reservoir in British Columbia. It's a very isolated place deep in the woods. We got there by driving up an old logging road. The actual reservoir itself is very beautiful and quiet. I actually looked up the area on Google Maps, and it still gives me chills even looking at it from a satellite perspective, but anyway. So the day passed without incident. We mostly just swam the whole day and went to bed, but the following morning I woke up in my parents' tent just as the sun was making its appearance. I unzipped the tent and noticed a figure standing maybe 50 feet away. The light was fairly dim, so it was hard to make out distinct details, but it was just standing there staring at me unmoving. The entity had the figure of a woman of average size, but instead of seeing a face there was just darkness. But I could tell it was looking at me. And instead of clothes, the skin it had were leaves and sticks as if it were made from them. I remember feeling very afraid of this creature, like if I had left the tent, I wouldn't be seen again. So I tried waking up my parents, but they were both really annoyed I woke them up, and didn't believe me until they finally got up later and explored the area. We ended up finding a bunch of man-made structures made of branches and other weird stuff in the area. I was 14 years old when I went on this camping trip with my family and best friend. It was nighttime, and my friend and I decided to walk over the park at the campground to swing. We get there and I instantly have this bad feeling, but I ignore it. We start swinging and I can't help but look to the top of the playground. It was like a big jungle gym with a tower at the top. Standing there was this young boy who couldn't have been older than 6. I couldn't make out his face, but it was dark to a shadow, so I knew it wasn't a bad spirit. He was sobbing and begging me to help him. He said his parents didn't love him and that he was practically the black sheep of the family. The last thing he told me was that he wanted to pass, and I needed to leave. It felt so real, I wanted to save him, but I knew that this wasn't an actual boy. So I freaked out and started running back to camp with my friend following. When we got back to the camper, I told everyone what happened and my friend said she saw and heard nothing. My stepmom's face went white and said that we need to go see my mother now. Well, my mum was on the phone, so she didn't hear what happened. Turns out my mum was on the phone with my aunt, and my aunt was ready to take her own life. She's the black sheep of the family and my grandma doesn't like her at all. So what I was seeing and hearing was exactly what my aunt was feeling and thinking. We talked and I told her everything I experienced. She knew after that it wasn't her time to go, and that we shared a special bond. Thankfully, she's still around today. A while back, me and my partner were backpacking/hitchhiking around Germany, with our eventual goal being Berlin. We got there pretty fast, seeing as we didn't have any money at all, living off donations of people who picked us up on the way to Berlin. Having no money meant sleeping in a tent in the streets. We were planning on staying in Berlin for a while, so we decided that we could take the opportunity to sleep in different spots in the city every night. Now, one of those nights turned out to become one of the most disturbing experiences of our lives. We were pretty tired as most of our days in Berlin pertained to walking around the city most of the time, checking out places to sleep, and we eventually settled for a place in the middle of the city next to a bridge crossing a river. We pitched our tent and had dinner. After that, I started to feel real anxious about the place we chose for the night, so after looking around I found several harrowing needles around our campsite. We sat down and started talking about leaving that place. We were both really tired, but also really uncomfortable with the place that we were staying in now. So while my partner was looking up other places to stay that were more comfortable, like a city park, I started getting a weird deja vu feeling. A feeling that the choice we were about to make would be an extremely important one. My partner found a park, and I was just glad that we could leave, so we packed our tent and started heading towards the park known as Rixendorfen Hohe. By the time we arrived at what we now found was a forested hill, it was already dark. We headed up thinking we would get some privacy somewhere high on the hill. After a climb, somewhere half up, we found an open place, which under any normal given circumstance would have been perfect. Only I did not feel safe there at all. By now I was feeling such a drag to my partner, but the type of anxiety I was feeling was one I'd never felt. I started scouting around the place, and the source of my anxiety became clear. On the path up to our clearing, I saw something I can only describe as someone staring at us from a distance. I was paralyzed, just staring at this man. After composing myself, I convinced my partner to not take this place, but instead to head higher up. While climbing, I tried to tell him what I'd seen, but also that I didn't think the thing I saw was human, and tried to convey that the fear I felt was of a paranormal kind. He believed me, but it was also scaring him a bit, but we kept heading upwards. Eventually we reached the top of the hill, where there was a huge clearing decorated with steel stones in a circle of some kind. I still felt really on edge, so I didn't want to pitch the tent immediately. I wanted to calm myself down first, so I told my partner I was going to meditate, and asked him if he wanted to meditate with me as well. I tried meditating, but I was too scared to close my eyes. After some time of not meditating, but really just staring at the tree line, I gave up, and just looked around the place we were at. The first thing that caught my eye was a tree separate from all the others, somewhat in the middle of the clearing. For some reason I couldn't divert my gaze from this tree, and that's when I clearly saw it. A black figure seemingly in the tree waving its arms almost like a dance. I was having none of it. Scared, I started yelling at it to go away. That's when my partner noticed it as well, something he later described as a clear aura outline. He joined me in telling it to back off, only it didn't. Instead, I heard it approach more and more. But what I heard sounded like static, followed by a hard tick on my nose. I immediately stood up and told it harshly to piss off without fear, after which I immediately apologized as to not anger whatever the hell we encountered. We picked up our bags and practically ran down the hill, totally forgetting about our tiredness, and just kept running and kept talking to the forest, thanking the spirit for the encounter and telling it I wouldn't seek contact and confirmation of further proof of existence of spirits anymore. I kind of felt like a crazy person, but the shared experience told me I wasn't going insane. We kept running, and nearly down the hill my partner stepped into a big pile of horse poo, which lightened the mood almost immediately. While me coming to the hasty conclusion that this was all an elaborate joke of some trickster. We safely made it out the park, but the experience was one I'll never forget. We ended up sleeping in Marianneplatz, close to where the other hobos set up camp as well, and where half the place is squatted by punkers. So now the reason for posting this story. Have you guys ever heard of this place? Maybe people in Berlin who can check it out themselves? I don't think the entity we encountered was evil per se. I'm just quite sad about how I handled the situation. I have the feeling perhaps I could have communicated with what it was, but sadly I've left Berlin now. And also, it's way over my head when it comes to that stuff. Let me know if any of you have been that way and have felt something similar. My mum and I were camping in our local national park in the Alps. I had a headache and had had a rough night. My mum, who I thought had slept well, hadn't. The next morning she told me about a dream she had, and that it was very realistic and it scared her. She thought she heard men talking outside our tent in a foreign language and thought that we were going to be in trouble, being that we were two women alone in the middle of nowhere. Then she saw a woman walk slowly just next to our tent while looking at us in a kind of farm outfit. Next thing she saw was a whole lot of people dressed in white in trenches just being there. I will add that this national park was back in the day the site of a world war, and that there are many abandoned buildings from the war in this area still. Sometime after, she was looking at where we were at on Google, and saw that there was a single flashing dot on the exact spot where we slept. Tonight, we're looking for it again, but it's not there anymore. I didn't feel anything in particular that night, and I did not think that my mum was having just a bad dream. Could it have been sleep paralysis? It's a very strange experience. Hey guys, thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. Camping is always a topic I think you guys really enjoy. Like I said at the start, Audible legit is a really cool thing. I have listened to so much Audible. I'm probably going to check my stats, and I know I've listened to many hours. Sherlock Holmes is like 40 hours or something. I don't know how much all the Harry Potter books are combined, but it's probably a lot. Then all the other stuff I've listened to as well. Maybe I'll put a picture up or something. In any case, check out the link if you're interested. A month for free. A huge thanks to all my lovely patrons and my members, something that you guys can be a part of if you wish, and you get fancy perks for signing up. So, think about it and let me know. Finally, I've got something else for you to watch. I narrated this video over on History Profiles about Vlad the Impaler. My goodness, he was worse than they make out. I really would check it out. It's a really interesting perspective of the so-called villain, the inspiration for Dracula. I would highly recommend it, even if it's just to learn his history, because it's really fascinating. Alright then guys, you've heard enough from me. But if you want to hear more, you know what to do. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.